Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Woche, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom, and it is the schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. So we finished Perek Gimel, the third chapter of Tanya, and we're now entering into the fourth chapter. And in this highly sophisticated and structured way, the Alter Rebbe is taking us through a journey in the very anatomy of the divine soul. That's what we're in the middle of. As we discussed from Perek Beis through Perek Hey, chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all dedicated to understanding the divine soul, the Nefesh Elokis, which is called the Nefesh Hashenis, the second soul within every Jew. The first one is discussed and described at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, the Nefesh Habamis. But we won't return to the Nefesh Habamis until chapter 6. So after explaining in chapter 2 the very essential core nature of a soul, that's a chelik elikam emal mamish, and vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, that the innermost divine imbued and breathed and instilled its power, the divine power within the neshama, and neshamas are called bonim atem la'Hashem alekechem, like a ben, which is not like a student. A ben actually comes from etzem moyach ha'av, from very core genetic matter of the father. And hu v'chachma se'echa, the Eibishter is one with his chachma, with his mind, so to speak, and that is all what defines a soul. That was in chapter 2. And all souls are in that category. Even if there are levels in the souls, like he describes there, the highest levels to the lowest levels, they're all fundamentally a piece of godliness. In chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe continued that this now manifests in the faculties of the Nefesh Elokis. Not just the very core soul, but its faculties, which break into two, Moichin and Midas, its conscious faculties of the Nefesh Ruach Neshama of the Nefesh Elokis, and discussed at length of how the Moichin, the mind, the cognitive faculties of the divine soul focus on contemplating on the greatness of God. Mamal Kalam, Seviv Kalam, and Kula Kamei Kala Choshiv. And then in turn, that gives birth to first Yireh b'moyach, a sense of reverence still on a cognitive level, which then translates into the emotions of the heart, pachad, and then ava, a burning passion to connect with this divine. So Chochmah and Bina give birth, they're the parents, Abba ve'ima, and Das is the hiskashus, the fundamental intimate connection that really is necessary to give birth to truly sustainable emotions. That was chapter 3. Now in chapter 4, the Alter Rebbe continues. This is not yet the full picture. We now know what the soul is like. We know its faculties. But then there's the soul's manifestation of how that is actualized. What I mean by actualized, not just how it is in the cognitive and the emotional faculties. But remember, an neshama has to also be active, has to be functional. And now we're going to talk about its functionality, its expression. So we're going to be introduced to another concept called levushim, the garments of the Nefesh Elokis. And garment, as opposed to a faculty is the very core of a person. You can't change your faculties. You're born with them. They're part of the soul. They don't define the soul. The soul is greater than its faculties. But the faculties, think of it on a body level, the skeleton. Your arms, your legs, your eyes, your ears, all of your physical body is not something that's changeable. The color of your eyes, your height, and so on. The same thing in the nefesh. That the keiches ha-nefesh, moichin and midas, are hardwired of who we are. Levushim, on the other hand, what's a levush? A garment. You put on a garment, you take off a garment. So we're going to learn inside, shortly, that there are three levushim, three forms of expression. They're called machshava, dibur, maisa. So what's the critical message and the key points in this chapter are going to be two major points. One is that in a divine soul is not just that the faculties are divine, that the mind, the cognitive, the focus of the mind, and the emotions are all directed toward the divine, because remember, we're talking about the divine soul, not the animal soul, but also its expression, its very expression, because you can have a mind and you can have emotions that are divine, and though we talked about the actual mind act being active and the emotions being active in contemplating on the divine, on godliness, and turning it into an emotion, a love, and a reverence, and a pride of godliness, and the same with all the emotions, but still there's one more thing. How is that implemented? That could all still be within the human being. Machshava dibra maisa, as we're going to learn, is its expression. So you can have in your mind many, many ideas. Machshava is the conscious thought. Right now you're thinking about Torah. The same thing with dibur. You're speaking about it. Now, machshava dibur and maisa without faculties are just like garments hanging in a closet. They're empty. On the other hand, the faculties without machshava dibur and maisa have no expression, because if you don't actively think or speak or act, which is machshava dibur and maisa, it's not being implemented. So now he's adding that in addition to the faculties, we're also going to talk about the garments. So on one hand, the garments seem to be external. They're necessary, but external. But he's going to explain this in the later part of the chapter. Well, after we finish the initial introduction, not even later, after a few lines, that in truth, these garments in many ways have something, an advantage, when they are expressing Torah and mitzvahs. In machshava dibra maisa, they have an advantage even on the very core nature of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the divine soul. Because the divine soul is wired that way. And now, when a person thinks, speaks, and acts according to Torah and mitzvahs, he's manifesting the unity that Torah and mitzvahs brings into his very being. And that has a quality even over the very nature of the divine soul. And we're going to discuss what that means. So now we're talking here, we're bringing the divine soul beyond the faculties into expression in this world, machshava dibur and maisa. Remember, an neshama in Gan Eden, in Atzilus, in its source, can also have moichen and midas. That's what neshama does. It learns Torah and it has ava v'yirat Hashem. But it's only in this world where machshava dibur and maisa is critical that we perform, which is the main thing, is to bring that into action and into words and into thought. In other words, into a conscious expression. And the divine soul, obviously it's a divine expression. And as we'll learn, that's going to do something that's even greater than the very neshama itself. So in a way, you can say this chapter is also going to explain what Torah and mitzvahs adds. You could say after chapter 2 and 3, great. It's a divine soul, at its very core, divine. It now also has keiches, which are also divine, cognitive and emotional divine faculties. And that's that. Send the neshama down to earth, is going to have to contend with an animal soul, but you have everything you need. No, we need one more thing. When it contends with the animal soul, there's going to be a battle over the levushim. Who's going to control the thought, speech, and action of the human being? Later we're going to learn how important that is when it comes to the Beinoni. Because you can have divine faculties, but you also have a nefesh habamis that has animal faculties that we learned in the end of chapter 1. So we need to now also implement it, because you can have the divine soul. It potentially can love God and revere God, which follows a cognitive contemplation, chochmah, bina, and das in godliness. But the bottom line is, in action and in speech and in thought, the animal soul can be in control. So we need to understand how the divine soul manifests and expresses itself, so it has a powerful edge, so to speak, an ability to also bring that divinity of the soul and its faculties into the expression of thought, speech, and action. And indeed, here's where Torah mitzvahs is going to be critical. Because as deep as a neshama is godly, we need Torah mitzvahs. It's not enough just to have a divine soul, as we're going to learn the reason why. And the most important reason is because in this world, the neshama is now descended and is not necessarily revealed its divine connection. And Torah mitzvahs is a revealed connection directly to Hashem. So even though the neshama is a ben, bonim atem l'Hashem elokechem, but a son, a child of a parent, is not an extension of the parent. It's an extension spiritually and genetically. But the child is separate from the parent. It's not like the arms and legs of the parent. In the nimshal, in the moral, the same idea. A neshama is yotzev v'nifrad, as he explains later in Ageres HaKedesh, in the 4th section in Tanya. He talks about that the neshama is yotzev v'nifrad, kelim of Atzilus, which means it became a yesh, it became a mitzias. It's a child. Yes, that child carries the very essence of the divine. Vayipar ba'apav nishmas chayim, etzem moyach ha'av, and hu v'chachmos echad. But it's not necessarily revealed. Torah mitzvahs, on the other hand, as we're going to learn, is in a very extension of the evorim, so to speak, the limbs and organs, kavyachol, of the Eibishter himself. So more than just a child, it has that actual connection. What Torah mitzvahs does not have is to be the ambassador of God that performs it. Torah mitzvahs are, in a sense, static without a human being doing something with Torah mitzvahs. So you need the neshama, because the neshama, that's what plays out, that the divine soul. It uses Torah mitzvahs to connect with, in a very open and revealed way, the unity of the divine. Both down here below, and even in the root, these garments that manifest Torah mitzvahs and machshava dibra ma'aseh are going to have a quality over the very neshama itself, the nefesh ruach neshama of the soul, of the neshama, the divine neshama, and they both need each other to have the full-blown experience of bringing the divine into this world in an expressive way, in a revealed way. And not just that it remains, the child is connected be'etzem, fundamentally to the father, but it actually is expressed. And the child is living its life with its thought, speech, and action following it. So that's the addition over the faculties and of the divine of chapter 3 and the divine nature of the soul in chapter 2. So that's a brief summary of what we're going to be learning now. And it's, when you think about it, it really puts into context everything here. There's the Eibishter, there's this Torah mitzvahs that he gives us, and there's the neshamas. I should go in the other order. Because in chapter 2, he didn't talk about Torah mitzvahs. He talked about the very nature of a soul. Almost like biological, obviously the spiritual biological nature of a soul. In chapter 3, he talked about the faculties. But Torah and mitzvahs, actual Torah and mitzvahs, which is the yesod of all Aveda, is in chapter 4, because now we're talking about how it's going to be expressed and how that reveals a dimension of divine unity that is dafkin through Torah and mitzvahs. And obviously it feeds right into the very divine nature of the neshama. But you need both. So the neshama is the actual entity that plays it all out. But Torah mitzvahs is a critical component in the revealing of the divine all the way down here below in this world. The divine has manifestation through the thought, speech, and action, which will give it the ability to then now deal with the animal soul, where neshama comes down, naguf, and v'nefesh habamis, where the animal soul is also going to be battling for control of this thought, speech, and action. But now we're discussing how the divine soul manifests through thought, speech, and action. And later in chapter 9, he's going to come back, and after chapter 6 through 8, where he's going to talk about the animal soul. In chapter 9, he's going to come back and say, okay, now let's talk about the confrontation and the battle between the divine soul and the animal soul. But the first thing is the Alter Rebbe has to establish what each one is before getting into their battle, because we have to understand what a divine soul is and then what an animal soul is. So you see the structure here. Perek Aleph, the end of Perek Aleph, he begins, there's two nefoshes. Starts with the animal soul. Perek Beis through Perek Hey is a divine soul and all aspects of it. Perek Vav through Perek Ches is 5, 6, 7, and 8 is about the animal soul and klippus and all the negative elements. And then in chapter 9, he's going to talk about how these two now meet. But now we will have then, the characters have been put into place. We understand the characters here, meaning the divine soul and the animal soul, and then how they confront each other and what we do with that confrontation. So that's the structure. And if you, and again, think about it, it's tremendously organized and eloquent in the way it's presented. So let's now learn inside in Perek Dalet. We're beginning chapter 4 of Tanya. So now you see right away the Alter Rebbe begins. After talking about the faculties, the 10 faculties, the Sholosh Imais, the 3 mothers, Chachma Bina Das, and the Sheva Kfules, and the 7 doubles, which are the 7 emotions, as discussed in the beginning of chapter 3 and throughout chapter 3. V'oid, furthermore, or in addition, Yesh l'chol nefesh alikis, every divine soul possesses shleisha levushim, 3 garments. 3 garments. Now these garments, as I said before, are neutral. On their own, thought, speech, and action is like a jacket or a shirt in the emotional gashmi. Obviously, l'mayla and ruchni it's deeper than that. It's not that separate. But al derech zeh. Now, what kind of shirt you're going to put on, and whether it's going to manifest a clean shirt or a dirty shirt, that's already up to a person. The faculties, you can have a clean body and put on a dirty shirt. You can have I don't want to say a dirty body because we're talking about the divine soul, but machshava dibur ma'isa are neutral. But they're the only ways we express the faculties of the soul. There's no other way to express yourself. So just like a person who's wearing garments, the garments express their beauty. It expresses the person's personality. So here, the divine soul, he says, every nefesh elokis has 3 garments that express its divinity, its very godly nature. And what are these 3 garments? Shehem, machshava, dibur, umaisa, shel taryag mitzvah satera. These are the thought, the word, spoken word, dibur, speech, or deed, and deed, and maisa, and action, shel taryag, devoted toward, and expressing Taryag mitzvah satera, the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Now, why does he have to add that? We just said this thought, speech, and action, because he's talking about a divine soul. In a divine soul, the expression is going to be through Taryag mitzvahs. That's how we express ourselves. How does a divine soul express itself? An animal soul, later we're going to learn, it expresses itself through thoughts about its own needs and its own selfish desires and its own temptations. And it speaks about that and it acts on it. But the nefesh elokis, the divine soul that he's talking about, what does it think about? What does it speak about? What does it act about? Taryag mitzvah satera, because that's what the neshama does. It lives up to and fulfills and manifests that which God gave a Torah mitzvahs, the Taryag mitzvah satera. So that's how these garments are preoccupied. That's what they're coming to express. It's just like when you speak, let's say, you talk about a person who's a business person. What do they think, speak, and act on? Their business. A person who's an artist, his thought, speech, and action is about his artistry, his creativity. Everybody uses their thought, speech, and action based on their personality and their needs. The divine soul, what is his thought, speech, and action? Taryag mitzvah satera. The thought, speech, and action. He's going to spell out what that means specifically. The thought, speech, and action of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. And when you do that, you not just have the faculties of the cognitive and the emotions that we spoke about in chapter 3. It's actually now coming into a very conscious expression. You're actually consciously thinking about it. And you're speaking about it, and you're acting on it. So in truth is, as we're going to learn shortly, when a person contemplates ungodliness and it comes into emotions, if it's going to be a conscious experience, it has to be either thought, speech, or action. And we're going to learn the details in a moment. But any contemplation means that the seichel is being manifest in machshava. Listen, a person can also be asleep. Their mind is working, but machshava is not necessarily under their control. Or you could be thinking about neutral things. So the garment is an active choice of the person. What garment, how are you going to express what's in your mind? So to have a contemplation, Aizbonanus, Nelakus, Chabad, Chochma Bina Das, and the Midas of Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, all the way through Malchus, its manifestation is going to be through these three garments. This was not addressed earlier. He addressed the general idea of what a divine soul's faculties are like. But now we're talking about its actual expression. And that really creates the full consciousness, a full state of consciousness that you're completely consumed with it. Like I mentioned before, you could have a divine soul, you could have its faculties, but you could be busy doing other things with your machshava dibur maisa. But here we want to speak that the Geshlesh Levushim of the Nefesh Alikis, and this is dafka of the Nefesh Alikis, as it expresses itself, is the machshava dibur maisa of the 613 mitzvahs HaTeirah. And now he spells it out. He starts from the bottom up. Maisa, and he's going to go to dibur and then to machshava. From action, behavior, to speech, to thought. So he says, when a person, when a person practically observes all the action-related mitzvahs, mekayim b'maisa kol mitzvahs maisis, which is the primary mitzvahs, even though there are mitzvahs b'machshava and b'dibur, as we'll be learning, but the most mitzvahs are mitzvahs maisis. Shabbos, kashrus, tefillin, mezuzah, they require action. We're coming from sukkahs, mitzvah lulav, sukkah. There's an action-related element to it. Yes, there has kavana and intention, and there's things that need a bracha, and there's an element of dibur, an element of thought and kavana and intention, but the mitzvahs maisis. So when a person performs and observes memaisa kol mitzvahs maisis, all the action-based related mitzvahs, that's in maisa. And in bedibur, what's in dibur? Ubedibur u esig bepirush, befirush kol taryag mitzvahs elchaseim. And in speech, he uses his speech to discuss, to speak about the 613 mitzvahs and their laws. So when you're learning, you're speaking v'debartabam. It's an element of speaking. And what's machshava? Uba machshava. Hu masik kol ma she'efshalei lahasik b'pshat remez drus sod hateira, b'pardes shebeteira hateira. And you immerse, and the person immerses his thought in whatever you can grasp, whatever is possible, from Teira, which means Teira literature, Teira text, whether you're learning Teira Shebiksav or Teira Shebal Peh, and all four dimensions that of how we analyze Teira. We know Teira can be learned. In this case, we're talking about thought, even though there's an element of speaking about Teira, which he just mentioned, but primarily learning is in thought. And thought has specific thoughts. You're not just thinking general thought, I'm going to learn a piece in Teira. It manifests in Pshat, which is the literal interpretation. Remez is the allegorical interpretation. Drush is the homiletic. And say the mystical or esoteric. So when a person does that, hariklolos taryag evrei nafshei muluboshim betaryag mitzvus haTeirah. Then the general taryag evrei nafshei. So he's introducing now another element. We said before there's 10 faculties, 3 garments. Now he's saying there's 613 evrei nafshei, that the whole divine soul, which includes all the soul's 613 components, which correspond to the 613 mitzvahs. In Sefer HaCharedim, for example, and other places, talks about how each part of the body corresponds to another mitzvah. But the same thing is Evrei HaNeshama, the Evrei Nafshi of the Nefesh Alikis. Even though 10 faculties are its main place, but you really break it down, there's 613 components. So now when the action is involved in doing action-based mitzvahs and speaking, discussing the pirush, asing with pirush, explaining and learning the 613 mitzvahs, and the thought in pshat remez drusad, whatever is possible to understand of mitzvahs in the Torah. When a person does that, the taryag av evrei nafshei muluboshim b'taryag mitzvahs haTorah. The divine soul, the whole soul, because it's not just a piece. We want the whole human being its whole entire fiber, every fiber of its existence to be manifesting the divine, the neshama of chapter 2, the faculties in chapter 3, and now the garments and expression in chapter 4 of Machshava Dibra Maisa. So that's what happens. So the kol is tayag milubashim, the word milubashim from the word garment. The garments are now consistent with the faculties. So it's dressed through her garments, milubashim b'tayag mitzvos atera, through her garments, the three garments of thought, of action, speech, and thought, in the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. So if a person did not use their machshava dibra maisa, God forbid, in this direction, so remains, yes, the nefesh halikis remains a divine soul. It has divine faculties, but it's not being expressed. You can't say the human being is immersed and involved in it. But when a person does maisa mitzvahs maisius, says kol maisa kol mitzvahs maisius, he's mekayim, he performs, and he's asik and involved in. He's busy, involved, immersed in the tayag mitzvahs, b'pirush kol tayag mitzvahs, which is in the context of dibur, and then in addition to that, he is. In addition to that, there's the machshava pshat remez drus teira, pshat remez drus sad of teira, so that now the garments are dressing up and manifesting the tayag mitzvahs hateira. And that's the addition here. So we see also an additional point that's critical to point out here is that the neshama, the divine neshama, and its faculties, and now its expression corresponds and is very mirrors Torah mitzvahs. So it's not like you're doing Torah mitzvahs, which is one entity, and the neshama is another entity. No, the neshama itself has 613 evrei nafshe, 613 components that correspond with the 613 mitzvahs. So when a person does a mitzvah, maisa, dibur, or machshava, they're actually drawing that parallel. They're expressing that and reflecting that which is in the Torah is being reflected in a person's very being, in their nefesh, as it manifests through machshava, dibur, or maisa. So we're going to stop here. And as you see, it's the plot thickens, but it's in a beautiful development of the ideas of how the divine is not just empowered because it's fundamentally divine on all levels, as we learned in chapter 2. And not just, in addition to that, the faculties are saturated with divine intellect and divine emotions, but also in its expression, its outward expression, even the garments, which on their own are external, seemingly. Thought, speech, and action are neutral and essentially external. They're empty. But they too get filled. And that's how the tayag mitzvahs manifest through our machshava dibur maisa. And we're going to learn the power of that, what it does for the neshama, and obviously what it does in fulfilling the very purpose of existence. So we'll stop here. If you want to listen to this program and previous ones, go to TanyaApply.com. You can also pose any question you like. Everyone have a good tevach.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.